The morning Allara Marsh was dragged out of the Shenandoah County poorhouse by her hair, the temperature had dropped to 9 degrees, and the frost on the windows looked like the bones of dead leaves pressed against glass. She was 15 years old. She weighed barely 90 pounds, and the only possession she carried was a rain-swollen copy of a government pamphlet on freshwater fisheries that she'd found wedged beneath a church pew the previous autumn. "You're done here," Matron Cecile Granger said, shoving the girl's thin coat at her chest. The woman's lips were a bloodless line. "I won't have you frightening the younger children with your nonsense. Talking to rats, talking to birds, whispering to the creek like it's going to whisper back." She lowered her voice, though every child in the hallway could hear. "The Hendricks family says you were muttering at their livestock again. Their milk cow hasn't produced in a week. They're saying you hexed it." Allara opened her mouth to explain. She hadn't hexed anything. She'd been observing the cow's gait because she suspected a hoof infection, but Matron Granger had already turned her back. The door shut, the lock clicked, and Allara Marsh stood alone on the frozen steps of the Branchwater County Home for Indigent Children in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia in the January of 1937, with no family, no money, and nowhere on earth to go. If you want to find out how a starving, orphaned girl with nothing but a water-stained pamphlet built a fish farm inside a mountain that would one day feed an entire starving county, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Allara Marsh created in those cold, forgotten hills didn't just save her own life. It changed the way an entire region survived the hardest years America had ever known. To understand what happened next, you have to understand who Allara was and where she came from. She was born in 1922 in a one-room cabin near the town of Hawthorne Hollow, Virginia. A settlement so small it didn't appear on most maps, just a scattering of houses along Briar Creek where the mountains pressed close and the light only reached the valley floor for about 6 hours a day in winter. Her father, Thomas Marsh, was a quiet man who trapped muskrat and mink along the creek and sold the pelts to a buyer in Staunton twice a year. Her mother, Annie, kept a kitchen garden and sang hymns while she worked, old mountain songs that Allara could still hum note-perfect 60 years later. They were poor, even by the standards of a community where poverty was the common condition, but the cabin was warm, and Allara grew up knowing the name of every bird that nested in the oaks behind the house and every fish that swam in the pools below the footbridge. Her father noticed it first. Allara didn't just like animals. She studied them with an intensity that was unusual in anyone, let alone a child. At 4 years old, she would lie flat on her stomach beside the creek and watch crayfish for hours, narrating their movements aloud in a low, earnest murmur, describing to no one in particular how they walked backward and used their tails to dart away from shadows. At 6, she figured out which plants the deer preferred by tracking their browse lines through the hollow, mapping the patterns with sticks laid on the ground, then told her father where to set his traps based on the routes. He tried it her way and caught 3 mink in a week, more than he'd caught the entire previous month. At 8, she predicted a late frost by watching the behavior of the woolly worms and the way the catbirds had changed their roosting patterns. And she was right, 3 days ahead of the almanac. Her father started calling her his little naturalist, a word he'd read in a magazine someone had left at the general store. At 10, she began keeping a journal, not a diary of feelings or daily events, but a detailed record of animal behavior, water levels, plant growth, and weather patterns. She drew diagrams of fish in the creek, noting where they held in the current and where they fed. She sketched the inside of a muskrat lodge she found along the bank, marveling at the engineering of it. She wrote down questions she couldn't answer and marked them with stars, filling the margins with tiny, precise handwriting. People in Hawthorne Hollow didn't know what to make of her. A girl who talked to animals. A girl who spent more time watching minnows in a creek than learning to sew or can preserves. The other children kept their distance. Not cruelly, exactly, but with the wariness children reserve for anyone who doesn't fit the understood shape of things. The women at church exchanged glances when Allara recited facts about trout spawning at the Sunday school picnic instead of playing tag. Her mother defended her. "She's just paying attention," Annie Marsh would say, her chin lifted in a way that didn't invite argument. "There's nothing wrong with paying attention." Then the fever came. Scarlet fever swept through the hollow in the autumn of 1934. Thomas Marsh died on a Tuesday. Annie died on a Thursday. Allara, 12 years old and burning with the same fever, survived, though she later said she wished she hadn't. Not then. Not in those first terrible weeks. There was no family to take her. A distant cousin in Roanoke sent a letter saying he had too many mouths already. An aunt in Richmond never responded at all. The church arranged for her to be placed in the Branchwater County Home for Indigent Children, a grim stone building on the edge of town run by matron Cecile Granger, a woman who believed that idle hands were the devil's workshop and that orphans were, by nature, inclined toward idleness and ingratitude. The poorhouse was not a place designed for comfort. The children slept 4 to a bed in winter and 2 in summer. Meals were cornmeal mush in the morning and bean soup at night, with bread on Sundays if the donations allowed it. There was no schoolroom. There were no toys. There was work. Endless, grinding, repetitive work. And the understanding that you were lucky to have a roof at all. For 2 years, Allara hauled water from the well before dawn, scrubbed floors until her knuckles cracked and bled, peeled potatoes in a kitchen that was always cold, and mended sheets so threadbare they tore again a week later. She did every task assigned to her without complaint. And she did them well, because her parents had raised her to take pride in labor, even when the labor gave nothing back. But she also did something that Matron Granger could not forgive. She kept watching. She kept paying attention. She talked to the barn cats who lived in the shed behind the building, noting how they positioned themselves to catch the morning sun and how their hunting patterns changed with the seasons. She whispered to the chickens, observing that the ones given more space laid more consistently than the crowded ones. She crouched beside the creek behind the property and studied the way water moved over stones, the way certain pools held fish and others didn't, drawing diagrams in the mud with a stick. And she read. Every book, pamphlet, newspaper, almanac, and seed catalog she could find, smuggled into the dormitory after lights out, read by the thin gray light of the window, hidden under her mattress during the day. The other children thought she was strange. The matron thought she was defiant. The townspeople who encountered her on the rare occasions the children were taken to church thought she was touched, a polite mountain word for crazy. The journal she'd kept since age 10 was confiscated in her first week. Matron Granger flipped through the pages of careful drawings and behavioral notes and declared it nonsense and witchcraft before throwing it in the stove. Allara watched it burn without a word. Then she started a new journal the next day, writing on scraps of butcher paper she salvaged from the kitchen waste. When the Hendricks family accused her of hexing their cow, an accusation born from nothing more than ignorance and a sick animal, Matron Granger finally had the excuse she'd been waiting for. Allara was cast out. She walked north. She walked because there was no other direction that made sense. South was Hawthorne Hollow and the graves of her parents. East was the valley floor and the towns that had already decided she was strange. West was ridge after ridge of unbroken forest with no roads and no shelter. North, at least, led deeper into the mountains, away from everyone who'd failed her, and toward the only thing she had left: the wild. The first night she slept in a hollow log, curled so tight her spine ached for days afterward, listening to the wind move through the bare trees like a low, mournful breath. She couldn't feel her feet. She pressed her hands against her stomach and tried to remember the sound of her mother's voice singing. The second night, she found an abandoned tobacco barn with half its roof caved in, and a family of possums living in the hayloft. She built a small fire from dry stalks and sat so close to it that the sparks burned tiny holes in her coat. She ate frozen crab apples that made her stomach cramp and drank from a stream so cold it made her teeth ache. The possums watched her from the rafters with their black, unblinking eyes, and she talked to them in a low voice. Not because she expected them to answer, but because the sound of her own words was the only thing keeping the silence from swallowing her whole. By the third morning, her fingers were white at the tips, and she could no longer feel her toes. The temperature had dropped again overnight, and the world was glazed with ice. She knew, with the calm, analytical part of her mind that never fully shut down, that she was developing frostbite. She knew that if she didn't find real shelter within the next few hours, the cold would take her the way the fever had tried to, and this time it would finish the job. She would have died, should have died, if she hadn't stumbled into the entrance of what the locals called Jessup's cavern. It wasn't really a cavern. It was a long, shallow limestone hollow carved into the side of Kessler Mountain, a formation where an underground spring bubbled up through fractured rock, and the water ran at a constant 55 degrees year-round. The hollow was about 40 feet deep, 10 feet high at its tallest point, and open at one end like a wide stone mouth facing south. Ferns grew along its floor in January. The air inside was warmer than anything Allara had felt in days. She crawled in, curled against the back wall, and slept for 14 hours. When she woke, the first thing she noticed was the water. A shallow stream, no wider than her arm, ran along the left side of the hollow and disappeared through a crack in the limestone. The water was clear, and in it she saw movement, the flicker of small, dark shapes. Fish, wild brook trout, no longer than her finger, living in the underground stream as though the mountain itself had decided to keep them safe from winter. Allara lay on her stomach, just as she had beside Briar Creek as a child, and watched them. She watched how they oriented in the current. She watched where they gathered and where they avoided. She watched, and she began to think. She opened her father's pamphlet, Freshwater Fish Culture for Small Farms, published by the United States Bureau of Fisheries in 1931, and read it cover to cover for the 9th time. And an idea began to form, wild and fragile and stubborn as a seed pushing through frozen ground. What if she could raise fish here? The first months were brutal. She had no tools, no materials, and no one to help her. She lived on watercress that grew near the spring, on wild onions she dug from the frozen hillside, and on the small trout she caught with her bare hands when desperation demanded it. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her cough rattled in the hollow like stones in a can. But she worked. She carried flat pieces of limestone from the creek bed and began building low walls inside the hollow, creating a series of shallow pools, pens really, connected by channels she carved with a sharp rock and patience that bordered on madness. She lined the pools with clay she dug from the hillside. She diverted the underground spring to flow through each pool in sequence, so the water was always moving, always fresh, always that miraculous 55 degrees. She studied the trout. She learned that they needed moving water and a certain depth. Too shallow, and they stressed. Too deep, and they hid. She figured out that the larvae of caddisflies, which she found clinging to rocks near the spring's source, made ideal food for the smaller fish, while the larger ones would eat earthworms she dug from the leaf mold on the hillside. She began cultivating the caddisfly larvae in a separate pool, creating what amounted to a feed system without even knowing the technical word for it. She made mistakes, plenty of them. Her first attempt at a dam to control water flow collapsed overnight, flooding one pool and draining another. She lost a dozen fish before she figured out that a sudden change in water temperature, even a few degrees, could send them into shock. She learned that trout were territorial and would kill each other if the pools were too crowded, and that the trick was to give each fish enough space to claim a small territory while keeping the overall density high enough to be productive. She learned these things the way her father had learned to trap, through observation, failure, and the stubborn refusal to make the same mistake 3 times. By April, she had 6 pools. By May, the trout she'd captured from the underground stream were surviving, and some were feeding regularly from her hand. By June, some of them were growing, actually gaining weight, and Allara felt something she hadn't felt since the morning her parents died. Hope. Not grand hope, not the belief that everything would be fine, but the small, specific, hard-won hope that comes from watching something you built with your own hands actually work. That was when Odell Pritchard found her. Odell was 73 years old, a former schoolteacher who had retreated to a cabin on the north slope of Kessler Mountain after his wife died in 1929. He was a tall, thin man with a white beard and hands that trembled slightly, and he had come to the hollow to collect fiddlehead ferns when he heard a girl's voice talking, earnestly, seriously, patiently, to a pool of fish. He stood at the entrance for a long time, watching Allara explain to a trout that she was adjusting the water flow and that it shouldn't be alarmed. "You know," he said finally, and Allara nearly fell into the pool. "They can't understand English." "I know," she said, once her heart stopped hammering. "But I think they understand tone." Odell Pritchard sat down on a rock and looked at what this half-starved girl had built. The pools, the channels, the crude but functional system. And he didn't laugh. He didn't call her crazy. He said, "Show me how the water moves." That was the beginning. Odell became her teacher, her protector, and in time, the closest thing to family she had left in the world. He brought her food from his cabin: cornbread, dried beans, jars of preserves his wife had put up years ago that he'd been eating through slowly, as though consuming them too fast would erase the last traces of her. He lent her tools: a hammer, a chisel, a proper saw. He had books, real books, on biology and agriculture and civil engineering, and he gave them to her one at a time, like gifts, waiting until she'd finished one before offering the next. She devoured them the way a starving person eats, urgently, completely, with a kind of desperate gratitude. He taught her to read technical drawings and to calculate water flow rates using simple arithmetic. She taught him to read a creek the way her father had taught her, not with instruments or equations, but by watching what the animals did, where the heron stood, where the kingfisher dove, where the mink left tracks along the bank. Each of those signs told you something about what was beneath the surface. Together they expanded. Odell helped her widen the hollow's entrance and build a stone and timber frame over it, creating what was essentially an underground greenhouse, a long, low structure half buried in the hillside that trapped the earth's warmth and the spring's constant temperature. They chinked the gaps with clay and moss. They built a proper door from salvaged lumber. They added more pools, each one better designed than the last, with smoother channels and more precise water control. They experimented with different species. Odell had read about carp farming in ancient China and suggested they try raising carp alongside the trout, and they discovered that the carp thrived in the warmer, slower sections, while the trout preferred the cold, fast channels near the spring's source, a simple insight that effectively doubled their production capacity. By the end of 1938, Allara had 12 functioning pools producing fish in the dead of winter, when every other food source in the county had dried up, and the county was starving. The Depression had hollowed out Branchwater County like a worm through an apple. The timber industry had collapsed when the eastern mills closed. The farms on the valley floor had failed after 3 years of drought, followed by a season of floods that washed the topsoil into the Shenandoah River. Families were eating dandelion greens and boiling bark for broth. Children were going to school, when they went at all, with nothing in their stomachs and not enough flesh on their bones to keep warm during the walk. The county relief office had run out of funds in November. The Red Cross shipments came once a month and lasted less than a week. Allara began, quietly, to give fish away. She would leave a string of cleaned trout on the doorstep of a farmhouse where she knew children lived. She would bring a basket of carp to the church in Hawthorne Hollow and leave it on the steps before dawn, wrapped in wet burlap to keep it fresh. She left fish at the schoolhouse. She left fish at the homes of widows and at the shacks of families who'd been too proud to stand in the relief line. She never signed her name. She never asked for anything in return. She never lingered long enough to be seen. People noticed. Of course they noticed. Fresh fish in January was as improbable as roses in December, a thing that simply didn't happen in these mountains, not when the creeks were frozen solid, and no one had the energy to cut through ice to fish anyway. Rumors spread through the county like wildfire in dry brush. Some said there was a poacher working the creeks at night with a lantern and a gill net. Some said it was a miracle, that God was providing for the faithful just as he'd multiplied the loaves and fishes. The preacher at the Baptist church delivered a sermon on the subject, taking it as evidence of divine intervention. And some, the older ones, the ones with longer memories, the ones who remembered the strange girl who talked to animals and whispered to creek water, began to whisper a different theory. It was Reverend Amos Whitfield who followed the tracks in the snow and found the hollow on Kessler Mountain. He stood at the entrance to Allara's underground fish farm, looked at the pools glimmering in the dim light, the green watercress growing along the edges, the fish moving in slow circles, and he removed his hat. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. 2 years, Allara said. She was 17 now, thin, weathered, with hands rougher than any woman's in the county, but her eyes were clear and steady. "Would you teach others?" That question changed everything. Within a year, Allara Marsh was teaching families throughout the county how to build their own small-scale fish ponds and underground pools. She drew diagrams on brown paper and pinned them to barn walls. She showed farmers how to identify natural springs on their property by looking for certain plants, watercress, jewelweed, skunk cabbage, that only grew where groundwater was close to the surface. She taught them how to build clay-lined holding ponds, how to manage water flow with simple wooden sluice gates, how to cultivate feed from local insects and plants so they'd never have to buy commercial fish meal. She spoke at the Hawthorne Hollow Grange Hall, the same town that had let Matron Granger throw her out, the same hall where she'd once been stared at for talking about trout at a church picnic. and men twice her age sat in silence and took notes while a teenage girl explained the principles of aquaculture with a confidence that came not from education, but from 2 years of doing it alone inside a mountain. Not everyone accepted it easily. Some men bristled at taking instruction from a girl who wasn't yet 20. Carl Hendricks, the same man whose family had accused her of hexing their cow, stood up at one meeting and said he'd starve before he took advice from that peculiar Marsh girl. His wife pulled him back into his seat. 3 weeks later, his eldest son came to the hollow quietly, alone, and asked Allara to help him build a pond on their property. She helped without mentioning his father. Some women whispered that it wasn't natural, a young woman living alone on a mountain, and there must be something improper about it. And Matron Granger, who still ran the poorhouse, was heard to remark that if people wanted to learn fish farming from the girl who talked to rats, that was their own foolishness, and they'd regret it soon enough. But hunger is a powerful teacher of humility, and the fish were real. You could hold them in your hands. You could fry them in a pan and feed them to your children, and watch the color come back into their faces. That was an argument no amount of gossip could overcome. By 1940, there were 37 fish operations in Branchwater County, and Allara Marsh had designed or consulted on most of them. Several of those operations fed families who had been days away from abandoning their land entirely. Odell Pritchard died in the spring of 1941. He passed in his sleep at his cabin on the mountain, peacefully, with a copy of Walton's The Complete Angler open on his chest. He left Allara his cabin, his books, and a handwritten letter that said, "You were the best student I never had in 40 years of teaching. You were also the best teacher I ever had." Allara moved into the cabin but continued her work at the hollow. The underground farm had grown to 28 pools spread across 3 connected chambers, producing enough fish to feed dozens of families. She had developed techniques for breeding trout in captivity that the State Fisheries Board wouldn't replicate for another 15 years. She had created a self-sustaining ecosystem inside a mountain. During the war years, when food rationing made every calorie precious, Allara's fish farms became critical infrastructure. The county extension agent, a man named Harold Webb, wrote to the Virginia Department of Agriculture about what was happening in Branchwater County, and a team came to investigate. They expected to find a large commercial operation. They found a 20-year-old woman in muddy boots explaining the nitrogen cycle to a group of farmers in a limestone cave. The Department of Agriculture published a bulletin about Allara's methods in 1944. It was titled, "Small-Scale Fish Culture in Appalachian Spring Systems," and it was distributed to every county extension office in Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. Allara's name was on the cover. That was the same year Matron Cecile Granger came to see her. The matron was older now, smaller, her authority diminished by years and by the slow erosion of her certainty. The poorhouse had closed in 1942, and Granger was living with a niece in town. She came to the hollow on a cold afternoon in November, and she stood at the entrance where she could see the pools stretching back into the mountain, the green growing things, the silver flash of fish. "I came to say I was wrong," she said. Her voice was thin. "About you. About what you were." Allara looked at her for a long time. She thought about the frozen steps, the locked door, the 9-degree morning. She thought about the nights she'd nearly died in this very hollow, shaking with cold and fever, too proud and too stubborn to crawl back to a world that didn't want her. "You weren't the only one who was wrong," Allara said, "but I appreciate you saying it." She gave the matron a basket of smoked trout to take home. It was more than forgiveness. It was proof of the kind of person Allara Marsh had chosen to become. In 1946, Allara married Daniel Cope, a returning veteran who had grown up on a farm in the next county and who had heard about the fishwoman of Kessler Mountain from a buddy in his unit. He came to see the operation, intending to stay an afternoon. He stayed for the rest of his life. Together, they expanded the farm into a true enterprise. They built a proper hatchery. They added catfish and bass to their stock. They trained over 200 families in aquaculture techniques across 4 counties. Daniel handled the business side, the sales, the logistics, the negotiations with state agencies, while Allara continued to do what she had always done: watch, learn, adapt, and teach. They had 3 children: Thomas, named for Allara's father, Annie, named for her mother, and a boy named Odell, who never questioned why his mother sometimes stood by the creek and talked to the water. By the 1950s, Allara Marsh Cope was recognized as one of the foremost practical aquaculturists in the Appalachian region. She never earned a formal degree, never set foot in a college classroom, but professors from Virginia Tech and the University of Virginia came to study her methods. Her underground pool system, built when she was a starving 15-year-old girl with nothing but a government pamphlet and a desperate idea, became a model for cold climate fish farming that was studied internationally. She lived in Odell's old cabin until she was 74, when her children convinced her to move into a house they built for her closer to town. She agreed, but she walked up to the hollow every day until her knees wouldn't let her anymore. Allara Marsh Cope died on March 12, 2003, at the age of 81. At her funeral, the Branchwater County Grange presented a proclamation naming the hollow on Kessler Mountain the Allara Marsh Aquaculture Preserve. Her eldest grandson, Thomas Cope Jr., now operates the fish farm. Her methods are taught in agricultural extension programs across Appalachia. The spring still runs at 55 degrees, and the trout still flicker in the pools she built with her bare hands 66 years before. Here's what I want you to think about. When Allara Marsh was pushed out into that frozen morning, the world had decided what she was: a strange girl, an orphan, a burden, a nuisance, a girl who talked to animals and read pamphlets instead of doing sensible work. Everything that made her different was treated as evidence that she didn't belong. But those same qualities, the watching, the patience, the willingness to talk to a creek and listen for an answer, were exactly the things that allowed her to see what no one else could see: a warm spring inside a mountain, fish that could be raised in winter, a way to feed people when every other system had failed. The world didn't reject Allara because she was broken. It rejected her because it didn't have a category for what she was. And when she stopped trying to fit into categories that were never built for her, she built something that outlasted every single one of them. What about you? What is the thing about you that the world keeps telling you is wrong? The thing that doesn't fit? The quality that people around you wish you would just stop having? The curiosity that annoys people? The sensitivity they call weakness? The stubbornness they call a problem? What if that's not your weakness? What if it's the seed of the most important thing you'll ever do? The thing you were put here to build? The thing that only you can see because only you are standing in the exact place where the light hits it, right? Allara Marsh talked to animals. They called her crazy. She built something inside a mountain that fed a county and changed a region, and outlasted everyone who ever doubted her. If this story resonated with you, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things against impossible odds. Because sometimes the thing that saves us isn't what we carry out the door. It's what we refuse to leave behind.